Over the past few years, I've gotten more accustomed to cooking for myself at home. With a little effort, you can not only make something that tastes better, but it's also usually better for you. Although I have to admit I don't always choose to make the healthiest options. But let's be honest, cooking is work, and sometimes I just don't have the motivation to do it. Oftentimes, the meal I'm making for myself requires the use of a crock pot, a stand mixer, an air fryer, or some other appliance. So I wanted to spend my time on a project that would make meal preparation just a little bit easier for myself. Building some pull-out shelves in some of the cabinets would allow me to store all of my larger cooking appliances away, and still be able to access them without having to pull everything else out first to get what I need, which of course seems to always be in the back. Since my existing shelves are in good condition, my first thought was to reuse the shelves as the surface of what's basically going to be similar to a drawer box. So skipping ahead, I made kind of a prototype on the bottom right here. The sides are made out of 1x3s of poplar, and the surface is that particle board I showed you. But after making the first one, I noticed a few things that I didn't like. For one, the particle board is heavy and weighs the shelf down more than I would like. Another thing is all the poplar is butt jointed together and glued, and while that's plenty strong enough for the shelf, it just isn't very elegant. So I decided I'd like to make the other shelves with box joints. And the last thing is for this bottom shelf, I know I'm going to be trying to pull it open with my foot because that's the kind of lazy I am, but I need to install some kind of a peg or handle on top so I have something to grab onto. So here I'm just tinkering with a scrap piece of plywood to practice making a 1/2-inch box joint jig. As you can see, it took several attempts to get the jig right. All the notches that you see here are failed attempts where the box joint was either too loose or too tight. The basic idea is to have this peg or key that sticks out from the board that's exactly 1/2 inch wide. You then slide it over and set it up to be exactly 1/2 inch away from the blade by using a setup block. I then clamp it to the miter gauge and cut a notch using the dado stack. Some screws will hold it to the miter gauge more permanently, and from there I can start using a scrap piece of wood to practice cutting out the box joints. After cutting each notch, you then slide it over the peg and cut the next notch. And when you get to the end, you turn the piece around and then butt the next piece up next to it so you can cut the first notch in the next piece. And what you should get when you're all done are joints that fit together kind of nicely like this, even though these could be improved upon. But the problem is if you don't set your blade height to the thickness of your material, when you turn the pieces at a right angle to fit together like a box, they don't fit. After I finished learning about my incompetence, I used some 3/4 inch plywood to make a permanent jig. After I had a properly made box joint jig put together, I tested some more scraps and saw that I had some much better fitting box joints this time. After buying all the 1x3s, I set up a makeshift stop block on my miter saw and quietly slid them into place. Okay, maybe not so quietly, but having a stop block made cutting down all the wood really easy. One of these days I'd like to get a proper miter saw station set up. It took a little while to cut the fingers on all the pieces, but the jig did all the work for me. After all the pieces were notched out, I ran all the pieces through the dado stack again to cut out a 1/2-inch notch on what would be the top edge of each shelf. This is where the 1/2-inch sheet of plywood would nestle down and make for a flush surface all the way across. And the last two drawer boxes here have the groove cut in the middle for a more traditional drawer box look. I then used a circular saw to break down a 1/2-inch sheet of plywood. And here's a really good tip that's so vital to breaking down plywood. You always want to make sure since cutting with a circular saw freehand like this will never produce a straight cut. And that's all I have to say about that. I cut one dimension down on the table saw, and then used the miter saw to cut each piece down to final size. From there I just assembled all the parts together with glue and clamps, and unfortunately I only have enough clamps to do one box at a time, so this process took me a few days to finish all the boxes. For each box I'm using Lontan 22-inch drawer slides. You might have already noticed that these are soft close and side mount drawer slides. To install the inner slide on the drawer box, I set the outer slide down as a spacer and then use a punch to mark the holes. The other part of the drawer slide gets mounted flush to the bottom edge of the support, so I just butted it up against another piece of wood and then punched out the holes. It was around this time that I realized I forgot to install some washers under each drawer slide. The washers act as a spacer just to bump out the drawer slide a little bit farther so it doesn't catch on the face frame when you pull the drawer out. Back upstairs in the kitchen, I put some spacers in the cabinet to set each of the drawer slides on as I install them. This just keeps the drawer off the ground a little bit so it doesn't drag. A little bit of WD-40 helps the slides glide more smoothly. I also corrected how the drawer on the right sits in the cabinet so that it's even with the shelf on the left. And since there's nothing really wrong with the drawer on the right, I'm going to keep it. I figure there's no reason to undo my work. My Instant Pot is the tallest of my appliances I want to store here, so I set it in place and then measured the height, adding a couple inches just to make sure it's nice and comfortable. It looks like about 16 inches will do here, so I cut down a couple pieces of scrap plywood to 16 inches and then put them in place with the drawer slide on top. I can then take the spacers out and put them on the other side to do the exact same thing. Now when putting the drawer box or shelf, or whatever you want to call it, I've been using the two interchangeably. I actually had a little bit of trouble getting it to go in. There was a little bit too much of a gap between the slides on the left and right side inside the cabinet, so it made it hard for me to get the drawer box to grab on both sides at the same time. This is inside the cabinet looking at the outer part of the slide. You can see it's mounted using the little tab inside this cutout, and that allows me to get in there with a little pry bar and bend the slide out, which closes the gap a little bit. Each of the slides has 3 of these tabs, so you can bend any or all of them as needed. After getting all the shelves installed, I repopulated the cabinet with all my kitchenware. Which brings me to the downside of this project, which is the loss of shelf space. Since all the shelves need to pull out, you can't just cram stuff in there because it will bind up when you pull the shelf out. The last thing to do was install some sort of raised edge on the bottom two shelves. I took a scrap piece of poplar and cut it in half to use for both shelves. I then took a piece of wood from the box joint jig and traced it along both pieces, and then used the contour of a hose clamp to trace a rounded edge on the end of each piece. Over at the bandsaw, I roughly cut along this contour, and then used the belt sander to give it a nice rounded edge. I also rounded over the long edge just a little bit so it wasn't so sharp. Then back over at the bandsaw, I cut each of the pieces down to be about half an inch tall. I know these aren't particularly creative, but I wanted something low profile to go on the bottom two shelves since the other shelves won't be getting them, and making each one as long as it is will give more surface area for gluing, which will hopefully increase its lifespan.